Hello. Thanks for tuning in to this presentation as part of the virtual edition of the Sustainable Living Fair. My name is Jacob Bolin, and I'm a program manager for Plug-in NC, here to talk a little bit about electric vehicles. So I want to get started today by just playing a little bit of EV trivia. So if you're in the audience there, you can just kind of guess along, if you will. So first question, how many EVs do you guys think are present in the United States currently? All right, so for our next question, how many EVs do you think are registered in North Carolina? We can set the over under maybe at 50,000 vehicles. What do you guys think? We're actually going to be looking at about 19,000 EVs. That data is probably taking us through early 2020, probably January to February of 2020. So just to share a little bit about Plug-in NC before we move too far along here, we're a program that was founded in 2011 by a group of stakeholders and EV advocates across the state. That includes organizations such as Clean Cities Coalitions, founded through the Department of Energy. It also includes private entities, utilities, many other kind of groups that are really trying to drive the electrification of our transportation forward in the state. We kind of have a few different approaches in terms of kind of our program goals. One is to simply expand the resources and the understanding of the benefits of electric vehicles. And then we also have kind of a strategic arm where we work to push forward different initiatives within the state, help with the vast deployment of infrastructure, conduct workshops and trainings for business leaders, for governments, for public entities such as possibly fleet managers and other kind of various groups. So just to talk a little bit about why EVs and why now, we've got really quite a few different factors that are really kind of all coming together to create this interest and increased adoption of EVs. So if we kind of look across the spectrum, I'll just kind of share these four different kind of categories that are really contributing to this rising trend. The first that we're certainly all aware of, and it's really what brings us here today, is the increased need and the increased action for climate policy. So we're really seeing this happen at the local level, at the statewide level, certainly as I just mentioned in the public sector, but also we're seeing that with the private sector as well. We're seeing a lot of utility interest in terms of it being a beneficial electrification technology. So it's one of the tools that allows us to have basically a greener solution through the electrification of that technology. Now, manufacturers are also acknowledging that this is a growing trend and something that they can monetize and take advantage of by offering new products to the market. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then lastly, as we're moving along here, we're seeing that improved customer experience for driving electric. So those are going to be things like near instant torque, a very quiet driving, like experience where you don't have the same type of noise that you might experience with internal combustion engine vehicle. And then also, the expansion of charging infrastructure, the convenience of being able to charge at home. All of these things are really piling into the ecosystem of kind of this driving experience that going electric will bring. So if we take a look just at a few examples of kind of what's happening in each of these different spaces, most prominently kind of from the statewide side here in North Carolina for climate action and climate policy, we've got what's called Executive Order number 80 that was proclaimed by the Governor Roy Cooper in 2018, actually late 2018. And as part of this executive order, it set a goal for us to have basically an EV benchmark that we should strive towards by 2025, and that's to have 80,000 electric vehicles on the roads of North Carolina by 2025. So Plug-in NC and a lot of our relevant stakeholders are really working towards basically reducing the barriers to make sure that that can happen, not only so that we can meet it, but so that we can exceed it. We're also seeing a lot of action happening, as I mentioned, at the local level. The larger cities of Raleigh, Charlotte, Asheville, Durham are all going to be very prominent examples of that, but we're really seeing it not just with the large cities, but with many kind of local municipalities and towns kind of happening throughout. I kind of hinted on the beneficial electrification potential, so I won't spend too much time with that here. But again, it's a really great opportunity to have environmental advocates and utility interests kind of both at the table, really at this point fighting for the same mission, which is to reduce emissions and to provide a more stable electric grid, which of course will have widespread environmental impact. So I'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. I pulled just a couple of examples of manufacturer commitments for Ford, VW, Audi. We're really seeing like quite a few others. Really, I think at this point, all of the major manufacturers have made commitments for electrifying some form of their product lines. Certainly, some are doing more than others, but it's certainly a good move to see many of these manufacturers and OEMs kind of getting on board with producing electric vehicles so that we have a widespread number of models and options to choose from for our passenger vehicle purchases. Most prominently, I'll just kind of point out, Ford has made a really large commitment lately, which is going to be actually rolling out what they call their Mustang Mach-E. So they actually gave their kind of one of their bread and butter product lines, the Mustang, which has so much name recognition for the Ford brand. They kind of tacked it on to their first electric vehicle, and they, I shouldn't say first, they had a couple quite a few years ago with the Ford Focus and the Ford Fusion, which was a plug-in hybrid, but this is really going to be the first one where they're trying to kind of bring it to the market to compete with the likes of Tesla and the Nissan Leaf, where it's going to be pushing 300 miles of range. So be on the lookout for that. Those first kind of rollouts of the Mustang Mach-E should hit the road by the end of 2020. So we're getting to the point where we're actually seeing those products hit the road, which is certainly an exciting time. So moving on. All right, so let's take a little bit of time to discuss the environmental benefits for the driver. So first and foremost, as many of the viewers may be aware, for electric vehicles, there are no emissions at the tailpipe. So immediately from the driver's perspective, there is it's a much obviously cleaner technology. And then you start to pair that with some of the improvements that vehicle models and manufacturers are experiencing kind of year over year in terms of the increased battery efficiency. So for example, a 2020 Nissan Leaf is going to have a more efficient battery than, let's say, a 2013 Nissan Leaf. And so for each of those new products that hit the road, we're seeing that iterative process improvement from the battery efficiency standpoint. Most commonly, that's going to be measured in kind of an interesting kind of way, which is kilowatts per 100 miles. So in this case, instead of like an MPG that we would see for a normal internal combustion engine vehicle, this is going to be measured in terms of kWh per 100 miles. So in this instance, we're going to be looking for the fewer kWh, the fewer amounts of basically energy per 100 miles, the better performance, the longer that particular kilowatt hour from the battery will take us. And then we're also going to be pairing that with the greening of the energy grid, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a bit. But I've pulled a chart from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they've actually gone through and modeled the kind of relevance, the comparison between emissions of electric vehicles and essentially the kind of traditional internal combustion engine counterparts. And it's really cool to see because they've tracked it over time. And so we're seeing that as our energy grid, and our energy fuel sources become cleaner, as we incorporate more renewables, as we phase out coal, we're seeing basically the opportunity for the trade-off of emissions between gasoline and electric vehicles really growing larger and larger. So if we take a look at this chart that was actually released in February of 2020, that pulls the energy source data from 2018, we'll notice that in North Carolina, in our region, you would need to be driving a vehicle that gets approximately 85 miles per gallon in order to have the equivalent offsets that an electric vehicle has. So oftentimes kind of in this role, I'll hear kind of the questions of, well, instead of using gasoline, we're just trading that off for coal power, so what's the benefit? And not only are these vehicles cleaner today, but again, as we start to move towards cleaner and cleaner electric grids and fuel sources from our electricity production, then we're going to see this number grow higher and higher. And that's actually for the average electric vehicle right now, that 85 miles per gallon here in North Carolina. So if we have some of the kind of higher end or more efficient, again, kind of, hopping back to the battery efficiency aspect, those numbers creep towards 100 and 120 miles per gallon equivalency. And it's really nice to kind of be able to look across kind of this map and see, even in certain areas where you might expect there to be a more kind of heavy coal presence, maybe in the Midwest, for example, all of the MPG equivalents are still high enough to make that, again, a very significant kind of factor. It's pretty rare for folks to be, purchasing vehicles that are 40, 50, 60 miles per gallon. So again, and that's today for the average EV. So if we think about kind of what that's going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years, it's really a great opportunity for us to continue kind of moving that needle forward. And also, I know that we're here kind of from the sustainability and of course kind of the environmental aspect, which is certainly most important. But I do want to share, even at a time like this where we're experiencing some kind of unusual changes in kind of our oil economy to the COVID-19 crisis. This was, as you can see, updated in March 21st of 2020. So it was a couple of weeks ago. So that regular gasoline kind of average cost for North Carolina is probably a little bit high as it is today on April 9th, 2020. However, you still are able to see basically the trade-off for, the fuel cost comparisons. So, even with gas, hovering around $2 per gallon, the equivalent offset for, again, the conversion or the comparison for what the Department of Energy with this calculator is calling an e-gallon, we're looking at about $1 equivalents per gallon of gas. And that's on top of the fact that there are very, very limited maintenance needs for an electric vehicle. You don't have filter changes or oil changes or some of those kind of other kind of recurring maintenance needs. And then the last thing I kind of want to mention here from an economic savings perspective is from basically your engagement with utility. So as I'll share here in just a moment, as we've already talked about a little bit, there is quite a bit of interest from the utility perspective to incorporate electric vehicles effectively into basically our energy ecosystem. And in order to do that, utilities are offering programs such as pricing for when you use that electricity that actually could have some stacked benefits. So you could enroll in programs similar to what are called like time of use rates, for example, where you're able to charge your EV during off-peak hours. But not only your EV, you might also be able to take advantage of those really reduced energy savings, for running your washer, dryer, or other relatively large electric load applications or appliances at certain times of the day. So again, you can start to see some stacked benefits by incorporating an electric vehicle and working with your utility to basically have kind of a win-win approach there. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second. So as we transition to that topic, I just wanted to really pull essentially what I find to be one of the most kind of dramatic quotes about kind of this idea. But I think it really kind of helps send the message of kind of where we are with electric vehicles and the importance of effectively integrating them into our electric grid. And that's again where we're really going to start to see kind of that win-win approach from the environmental advocacy groups and also the utilities, where we can really see just some stacked benefit there. And there is some danger to increased adoption of electric vehicles right now if that goes unchecked. And that's simply due to kind of what's called peak load, and we'll get into that here in just a moment. So first, I just kind of, again, want to reiterate why this is valuable, why electric vehicles are valuable from a utility perspective. So if we think about it, it's pretty simple. So electric utilities are generally modeled off the fact of electric growth and load growth kind of principles. So they of course want to sell more electricity, especially kind of from a typical kind of IOU standpoint, but really that's of course going to be an interest for all electric utilities. So we'll see that generally an EV could add about 30% more electricity for a house per year. So just to share kind of a quick statistic, about 80 to 90% of electric vehicle charging does happen at home. So that's, is certainly going to depend on where you're located, your access to, let's say, public charging infrastructure, or if you have charging stations accessible at work. For example, of course, those numbers could change, but generally we're seeing about 80 to 90% of EV charging happening at home. And before I kind of move on too much, I also just want to share that, how EV charging works is a bit more like our cell phone than it is, let's say, a traditional kind of gasoline or gas station model. So, we're really going to take advantage of what's called opportunity charging. So as I just mentioned, if we have electric vehicle charging at work, we might not have to go from 0 miles all the way to basically a full charge at home. We basically just want to have the opportunity to cover the range that we need to get to the next place. So we obviously might like to have a buffer with that, but very rarely with our cell phone, for example, are we going to run it all the way to dead and then plug it in for a couple of hours and let it go all the way to charged up. So in most of our driving scenarios, that's going to be the same case for electric vehicles. We're really just going to want to make sure that we have enough charge and that we know when we're going to be able to take advantage of convenient and fast charging options, or even if we have, let's say, a very simple charger at home. Again, we can take advantage of reduced electricity rates possibly for that scenario. So anyway, moving on, so we've kind of established that the utilities have, quite a bit of interest in essentially the potential load growth for electric vehicles. Now, if we think about kind of the more complex and the more long-range plan, it is a little bit more nuanced than just adding load for the electric utility. So this is a graph that I'd like to share that the company that I work for that manages Plug-in NC, called Advanced Energy, conducted a couple of years ago. And this graph is actually tracking when and to what degree EV drivers plugged in. So essentially what it's doing for 40 different drivers, it's tracking these folks. And so they have access to both home charging and workplace charging, which is rather important. Now, to kind of get into the weeds just a little bit here to kind of explain this principle, we'll see that during basically the day, we see quite a few different peaks. So we're seeing one happen at about 6 a.m., And then as we move kind of throughout the day, we're seeing it really kind of reach threshold around 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. So these are kind of the ideas of what's called peak load. So if you think about it like, let's say, an interstate, we build our interstate so that it can accommodate at least reasonably well rush hour traffic, right? Which is going to happen as we all go to work and school and start our days, and then as we come home to basically kind of cap those days off. And that's going to be the same principle for how we use our electricity. You know, in the winter, especially as we wake up in the morning, we're going to turn the heat on, or we're going to have those thermostats preset to turn on so that we're able to get out of bed and start our day essentially in comfort. And then on the other end of that, you know, especially in the summer, when we come home from work at 5 and 6 p.m., we're going to turn on the AC, we're going to be cooking dinner, doing laundry, all of these different factors. Whereas during the middle parts of the day, kind of the belly of this particular graph and curve is going to happen in the middle of the day, where we're much more consolidated at work and school and other areas of like that, and our electricity demand is not as significant. So when we think about kind of how EVs add this to the mix, you know, essentially if 80 or 90% of our charging is happening at home, then we're going to be faced with essentially the same scenario where maybe we don't plug in during the day at work. And it's important to note that in this case, folks do have access to workplace charging and they are using it, just not as much as they're using it at home. And so what that shows is that EVs really, we need to basically flatten this curve, which is a pretty relevant topic right now here in April of 2020. But essentially, if we look to flatten this curve as much as possible, that allows the electric utilities to essentially understand and forecast what that demand will look like. Whereas if we have these really significant peaks, that's where there's going to be basically an abundance of, you know, what are called peaker plants and production of energy through kind of almost like emergency circumstances or extraneous circumstances at different parts of the day or the week or the month for like coal-powered plants, for example. And so the opportunity is to basically take advantage of the plants and the utility grid assets as much as possible. So we want to see as straight line, you know, this graph be as straight as possible. And in doing so, not only would electric vehicles be as valuable for us as EV drivers, but it would actually be valuable for all electric utility customers or members. If you're a co-op, it would basically allow you to basically use this technology as an asset to the grid. There are also some other opportunities for that to happen as we think about sending power maybe back from our electric vehicle to the grid. So maybe, for example, I've got the opportunity to actually charge up at work, and then I come home from work and I could plug in, as we're seeing right now with a lot of solar instances with what's called net metering. It's essentially the same principle where we would be able to use our electric vehicles as a grid asset. And so we would come home and we would plug in our EV, but instead of actually charging up our electric vehicle battery, we would have the opportunity to dispatch that battery power to the grid, which is a really neat concept, and it's in its early stages right now. But again, it's kind of the long-term goal and need for utilities and for us as individuals. If we think about kind of the big systems approach to our energy sector and the decarbonization of you know, our planet, is the importance of being able to utilize these aspects with our energy use and with our electric utilities across the state, across the country, and across the globe. So I just want to kind of close out today by sharing a little bit, if you're interested in learning more about electric vehicles and kind of want to see what options are out there for you. I just want to kind of leave everybody with a couple of tips for purchasing or for exploring the purchase, and also a few resources that you can use to find out more. So first, for tips for purchasing, I would just mention that it's really, really valuable to kind of learn where charging stations are in your area. So a lot of folks are really concerned about what's called range anxiety. So the idea that we can really trust the fact that we know how to get gas, right? We know how to go to the gas station and fill up our tank and feel comfort in basically how frequent gas stations are, how we're really never going to be tasked with, trying to decide if we're going to make it to the next gas station. So that's very rarely the case for electric vehicles as well. However, there is a perception that there's not a lot of charging that could happen, or that EVs can't handle a road trip or drive to see the family across the state or something like that. So I would just kind of share that folks really kind of learn more about the charging ecosystem kind of at play, and that's going to be your opportunity to charge at home, the kind of questions of maybe where are charging stations in the places that you work or play or shop, for example. I'd also mention to be a little bit careful when you're looking at EVs in regards to MSRP or retail price. Sometimes when the supply of these vehicles is in high demand, the MSRP actually could be an underestimate of how much you would need to spend. But in many cases, it's going to be quite a bit lower than the MSRP. A good example right now of that is the 2019 and 2020 Chevy Bolt. That's Bolt with a B. So that MSRP price, usually you can walk away from the dealership with a Chevy Bolt for a significant amount less than its list price. I'll also just take a minute, it's not on the screen here, but I just want to share that there is a used market for EVs as well. Now, oftentimes, the EVs that are in the used market are going to be from a couple of years ago, and they might not have the range potential that our new EVs do. However, if you really just need a commuter vehicle, especially, you can find some really good deals in the used vehicle market for EVs. So again, I think that really kind of fits into the decision-making process, and also the more comfort you have about where there are charging stations and how much you drive per day, the more accessible a used EV could be for you. Now, I also want to share that Plug-in NC and many other organizations and programs across the state of North Carolina will host what are called ride and drive events. So these are going to be really important for just gathering and sharing the value and the benefits and the fun of electric vehicles. So be sure to check those out if you're able to. Sign up for Plug-in NC's newsletter or follow us on social media, and we actually share a lot of those different events through there, and as well as, of course, the ones that we host. Now, there's also going to be one more kind of factor at play here, which is kind of trying to decide between an all-electric vehicle, like let's say a Tesla or a Nissan Leaf, or what's called a plug-in hybrid, which is actually a dual fuel vehicle that would allow you to usually drive somewhere between 20 and 40 miles on electric range before it would switch over to kind of a standard like gasoline powered essentially generator and engine. And so there are some really good options, of course, for both vehicle types, and depending on your needs, whether that's budget limitations or daily driving considerations or anything like that, just know that there are multiple instances. I know plenty of people that really try to, with their plug-in hybrid vehicles, never drive with the gasoline. So the only consideration that you would have with that is that you would still have some maintenance needs that you wouldn't otherwise have for an all-electric vehicle. So just keep that in mind. Things like oil changes, albeit they'd be less frequent. And then lastly, I'll just mention here that we want to explore federal tax credits. So there are still quite a few tax credits available, up to $7,500 depending on the manufacturer. So some of those manufacturers have tax credits that have now expired or lapsed because they've sold enough electric vehicles. However, as more EVs kind of hit the roads, more manufacturers are going to be eligible for those full tax tax credits. So be sure to explore those as well. And then just to wrap up here, I just want to share a few resources that I think would be most beneficial in kind of having these types of conversations. First and foremost, I just want to say plugin NC. So please, I'll leave you with my contact information, but please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments. We have the opportunity to talk about vehicles and talk about charging infrastructure all day. That's what we're here for. So please reach out to us if you've got questions about buying or exploring these technologies in more detail. Similarly, at a national scale, Plug in America has some really good tools on their website about available vehicles and different comparisons for driving range and things like that. From the infrastructure standpoint, I would encourage folks to check out PlugShare. So you can just Google PlugShare. It's available on the web and also through mobile phone applications. But it's basically a almost like a social media and interactive map for where charging stations are in the state. So it's a really cool interactive tool that allows you to basically see how many and where those charging stations are at, as well as get feedback from other drivers who share their experience at that charging station. So it's a really, really useful tool. And then lastly, I'd just say your local utility. So as I've kind of stressed through this presentation, almost always, especially here in North Carolina, your utility is going to be actively engaged in the opportunities and the needs and the considerations that come with electrifying our transportation. So check out some of their resources as well. So that's all I've got for folks today. I really appreciate anybody who's tuned in. I'd just like to leave you with my contact information. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you've got any questions or comments or want to talk in more detail about electric vehicles or charging infrastructure or anything in between. So with that, I'd like to say thanks and hope everybody is taking care and staying safe.